I'm here with Rachel Curtis today, and she's the CEO of Inicio, and they're in the affordability assessment space. Rachel, thanks very much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Obviously, you guys are in the affordability space. I want to talk a bit about digital transformation and particularly what you're seeing in terms of like some of your clients. I mean, it just feels like the whole world has sort of, started transforming their businesses. Everyone I'm speaking to is just incredibly busy in terms of like looking at digital transformation. And it'd be good to hear a little bit about what you're seeing with your clients and that as you're out in the industry in terms of what do you think the interest is and what's kind of like changed really since the start of the year.
Like you say, there's an awful lot of noise, and I think one of the things that we're seeing a little bit is an element of either paralysis or running around like headless chickens and everything in between, because I think organisations are dealing with a lot of problems at the same time. So there's still stuff coming out of the back of the pandemic where people had to just throw their operations up in the air and run them remotely overnight, which nobody was necessarily really prepared for. So there's still fallout from that, and the tech stack from that was kind of built up, and they're still working through that. Plus, then you've got growing volumes. So we know it's a living crisis and everything in the news. So people are trying to deal with more volumes. Plus, they'd got their old roadmaps in terms of what they were trying to develop, and they've kind of just got loads of stuff to do. And it is driving. Then on the other side of the situation, you've got a lot of organisations like us that are coming in and saying, "Hey, look, we've got a great solution. Look at what we do." I was talking to one client on Friday, and they were just looking at the affordability side, the income and expenditure side, and they were just being blown away by people talking to them around, well, we can do this, we can do it that way. And there's lots of different solutions, and there's also a lot of tech language that's used. And I think for organizations that haven't necessarily invested in the digital side of this element, they're getting a bit sort of like I say, paralyzed around, well, everybody's talking about AI, they're talking about different solutions within that, and people mean different things with the tech language. And yeah, just noise, lots of noise.
If you're a collections manager, if you're a collections, head of collections, I mean, how do you, the best way to sort of like navigate that and sort of like separate out those that are real solutions versus those that are noise that's coming through, just because there's so much dynamism, and it puts a lot of pressure on people's time as well, just to go through that. What's your kind of advice?
This will always be my answer because I've got a customer experience background, but my start point would be go back to your customer journey, your customer ethos. What is it you're trying to deliver, and what's your reason for being? Why are you there? Because that strips out a lot of the solutions quite quickly in terms of, what do I want my customer to experience, and therefore what do I need that provision to be? So I think that can help. And I say that from a point of view of, my background's banks and building societies, and I've been in the situation of choosing tech. And you get distracted because somebody will show you something, you'll be like, oh, well, that's good, and I like that bit, and I like that bit. And it is hard to actually then cut all of that and step back and say, what is it I need to deliver and why? And then the solutions become more obvious. I think the other thing for me is kind of getting underneath what's being offered. So I think demos are worth their weight in gold. Of, okay, you've told me about everything it does. That's great in principle. Let's have a look. Does it do what I need it to do? All of the things from how is it going to integrate? What data am I going to get at the end of it? How's the customer? What are they going to do if they get stuck? What are all those kind of elements, and just really understand what it will look like and what it will give you at the end of it.
That can be quite a problem in terms of like looking beyond the sort of the nice features that sort of like that sell very well, in terms of like what's the nuts and bolts around how it actually works. How do you sort of like judge the difference between, I suppose, what's the marketing side of things versus the actual implementation side of it? And I think you're saying is demos is a good way to look at that.
So we're trying to work with some charities to get real normal people that are in debt, that are trying to complete an affordability assessment or the SFS, and get them to actually use it. And that's really important from my point of view in terms of the quality of the product. Does it work for the people that actually need to use it? And that's standard build kind of information, isn't it? You whatever you've got, go test it, see if it works, that kind of piece. So that's important. But yeah, I just think it comes back to that customer experience, that customer journey. what do I need for my customers and where do I get it?
The other sort of trends out there is you can buy systems that do lots of different things, almost like the Swiss Army knife that does lots of different things. Versus then there's also sort of like a large suite of vendors who are doing very, very specialist things very, very well. There's a balance there, isn't there, in terms of like how you pick amongst that, and do you go best of breed or you do go generalist? I mean, and I suppose you guys are in the best of breed kind of space in terms of like where your kind of approach is. I mean, do you come across that in terms of like from a competition point of view, in terms of like the generalist side of things versus and maybe people not quite getting quite what they want, and I suppose there's a trade-off there, isn't there?
Yeah, and it's been really interesting for me. So I was at the Building Society's annual conference last week, and watching exactly the same challenge. Really, building societies are trying to, digitize and move forwards in what they deliver for their customers, and they're having the same problem because they've got lots of bits that they need, and they can either go out to the market and get all the specialist providers and manage them themselves, but that's not necessarily their experience. So some of them are looking for collaborations and lead software providers that are bringing in the other elements, and I think that's where some of the interesting conversations we're having at the minute are with partners that provide other elements of that journey, so that we can go to companies and say, okay, well, this is the bit we've got, but if you need these other bits, this is how it integrates in. I think the benefit for me, having come out of that more tricky tech background of sort of the banks and the building societies and all the legacy systems, is with all of the new providers, because they're built in the modern technology and low code, no code, whatever, they just bolt together so much more easily, and they're so much more flexible to integrate. So it is much more easy to do that. And I think there's a hurdle for people that have been in any of the industries for quite a while around believing that's as easy as you told it is, because initially I was kind of like, nah, that you'll say that's dead easy, and it won't be, and I'll have gaps between the stuff. But actually we've seen, we just did a Salesforce integration in sort of 2 weeks, because it's just really easy to do that in the new, more modern technology.
Because that's a fear, isn't it? It's sort of like, I'm going to have so many relationships. I'm not going to be able to I'm already juggling 10 plates already, and it's going to be another 20 plates. I'm going to have to sort of like knit the process together. It all needs to be managed. That, to a certain extent, is why you're sort of seeing the collaborations. But it sounds like it's probably easier, and to reassure people, it's easier than people think it is.
Yeah, and I think again it comes back to what problem am I trying to solve within an organisation that's trying to manage the debt around. Have I got really great systems and operations already? What is the problem I'm trying to fix? Because actually it might be you only need to fix one element. So it might be you only need an I&E provider, and you can get that piece and just bolt it into what you're already doing. Or you might have a much bigger problem. You might want a more end-to-end solution. So I suppose it's that starting from the point of stepping back and being really clear on the problem, rather than getting distracted by all of these exciting widgets that are out there. What is it you need?
And I suppose we're talking about the problem, and the problem you guys are trying to solve is the affordability problem, right? So, which we know certainly in collections is a large part of, certainly collections calls and those kind of things. What's been your view, sort of like coming in into the market with sort of like new tech, really, and sort of like your view of the problem, some of the problems that there are with it that need solving?
Yeah, so I kind of hold true to our founding story, really. So we started because one of our founders had an interaction with a pregnant lady that was trying to take her own life in traffic, and her. I'm speaking to her more. It was about because she was in debt and couldn't see a way out of it. Almost, well, actually, it was not being able to take that first step. She knew she needed to do this process, but was so embarrassed and felt judged by, being in debt and having to fill in an I&E and saying, well, yeah, I'm still vaping or drinking or whatever it is, or if I've got Netflix and feeling judged by that. So we did a lot of research around that to understand why people had got this real barrier around the I&E, and a lot of it is not wanting to speak to somebody to do that process. They're not starting it. And that's where we've come in with sort of using conversational AI, and it's built up. So our form is built by people speaking to the form, people trying to fill in the I&E form. So it's not like having a conversation with Alexa, who is dealing with lots and lots of very broad terms and a very wide range of information. Ours is very, very narrow, just on filling in the standard financial statement. And it means that it matches really quickly to what people are trying to say. So you can say to it, oh, I spend 40 quid on vaping, or water bills a tenner. All of these kind of, how we actually talk as human beings, and it will understand, which means that we solve a couple of problems. For the customer, they can fill a form in digitally, but get the support as if they're dealing with an agent, but without embarrassment. So it solves their problem. Also, they can pick it up and put it down when it's convenient if they need to run off and do the school run. We had a customer last week that was on the form for 27 hours.
Yeah.
And we're kind of like, I hope it didn't take them 27 hours to fill it in. And it didn't. They just kept dropping it and, doing other stuff in between, which you can't do on a phone call. An agent phone call for 27 hours is going to be quite a high cost. So it works from a customer perspective, but also from an organization perspective. You can leave that process to kind of happen and then get the information back in, and then deal with it when the customer's done that bit, without having that big cost of filling it in with the customer on the phone.
There are two concepts that are sort of coming across in a sense recently as well with the whole digital migration, one of which is persistency, which is the fact that the form will always be there. You can leave a process halfway through and come back to it. And the other one is almost like this asynchronous nature of conversation, right? Which is, I want to do a little bit of it, and I'll wait for a response, and maybe I'll come back and do a little bit later. And it's almost like those pieces which are very not telephone, which is a two-way conversation like we're having now, versus it being sort of a little bit more sort of disjointed. Do you sort of see that too in terms of how that's sort of playing out in terms of processes, and how big of a concept do you think that's going to be in terms of, like, I suppose, digital transformation?
Ultimately, what's the problem we're trying to solve? We're trying to get the income and expenditure information out of the customer so that we can work out what to do, where they need to be referred for, or whether we can get a payment plan and what that needs to look like. So that is the problem. And actually, we see agent calls where maybe the data quality isn't that great because we're just desperately trying to get the customer through that INE and get that information. And you might shortcut things, and they might say, oh, well, I've got that somewhere, but it's in the drawer. And it's like, well, let's just guess at a number, or let's just put something in there.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, and we did have a conversation with a client the other day where they were saying, well, can you demonstrate to us that filling in the INE with you is quicker than it is doing it with an agent on the phone? And I said, no, I can't. It takes longer, because the customer will do it in their own time, and they'll go and get those bits of information. What you get at the end of it is much better quality, and therefore you should have better quality payment plans or solutions. But it's not about being faster, it's about being better for the customer, and therefore better for the organisation in terms of what you get out at the end of it.
Do you think that filling out a form, so certainly filling out a form sort of digitally, an affordability form digitally, or an INE digitally, seems like that, customers are less nervous about doing that because it's a little bit more sort of impersonal, even versus an agent, right? So a trained agent. Do you think this sort of like the voice interaction spaces falls into that digital space? Do you think people are going to still have issues in terms of like verbalizing what their actual income or their actual expenditure is? Where do you think it kind of fits? Does it cross that barrier to going towards digital?
So the INE is a bit of a barrier for them, but actually, if you can engage them digitally and start to get them using it, and actually, so we use an avatar called Budgie that's deliberately not a human being, and we've done some testing around that to prove that actually a nice, friendly, chubby little bird is kind of easier to talk to. But actually, once they get started, what we see is some customers drop out to an agent because they might get a certain way through. They might have a question. They might want to have that agent interaction about something else. So it's almost like the barrier is to get them started. And one client, we're just getting the case study signed off, but the early stats show us that their payment plans have increased by 50%. Now, when I first saw that number, I went, that's ridiculous. That can't be true. But actually, what's happened by giving them that digital answer and just getting them started, we were getting some people drop out of the form, but then speak to an agent and actually go, okay, well, I want to do, actually, I'm just going to pay it off. I get it now. I'm just going to, and it's almost that the form is there for one reason, but it's serving a much broader purpose in terms of that engagement and that massive barrier that stopped people speaking in the first place. Once you get them started, it might be they don't do the INE, in a lot of cases that's what we need, but sometimes it might just result in a payment, which is, hey, that's what we're trying to get.
It's quite an interesting point in terms of like how much of our processes, and when we redesign processes, are we just being transactional, or are we just being, this is what the process is, and we can be very linear as well. We talk about linear processes as well, versus actually serving a purpose that actually does something different in terms of like prompting people to make a payment or those kind of things.
Yeah, and I think it's, like we're seeing everything about that customer experience, it's just creating that, starting the conversation may end you up in a completely different place, but it's how do you get that conversation started? And I think what we've seen, and it has surprised me, those payment rates, I'm really pleasantly surprised. It's going to make my job easier when I can put cases out saying payments have gone up by 50%. But it's that kind of, just doing something different actually can create a completely different response and get people started on talking to get an answer. Because we know customers in debt want it resolved as much as the organization's managing the debt, but it's just they avoid that conversation. We know they just don't open letters, they don't answer the phone, and we saw that was another stat that's come out that I think some of these customers were 18-month aged. They'd not been spoken to for ages, but by sending something different and a different contact option, got those people giving an up-to-date contact details. So it's just that, a change is as good as a rest, or whatever the saying is, just create that engagement.
I'm actually thinking in the background of actually, have you read that Seth Godin book, Purple Cow, I think it is? And he talks about that from a marketing point of view. Is like, you never see purple cows, but the fact I've mentioned a purple cow means that you remember it. It's that kind of concept, which probably applies quite well in collections actually as well.
You've seen that, through the industry, you've seen things change. Yes, it was always letters, then we moved to emails, then we've moved to text messages, and that's fine. We use QR codes, so we can put them on the back of envelopes, and people are, curious, aren't they? And they'll kind of scan it, and it's like, we've got them started, great. Whereas those envelopes typically went in the cupboard. We had one lady that kept them under the sink for some reason. But it's just something different.
We touched on it a little bit earlier around linear thinking, and we often redesign, we do digital redesign, digital transformation, everything's sort of like it's in alignment. So we design it almost like as engineers, right? But that's not necessarily the way humans think. And I think you mentioned it earlier around, humans will jump around all over the place, and that probably needs to go into our design as well, I would think.
Yeah, and it's that flexibility, isn't it? And we certainly see it, and it's why, I'd say our conversational AI tool is different, because it is built to deal with. So you can say like, oh, my gas bill's 60 quid. Hey, right now you'd accept a gas bill of 60 quid, wouldn't you? I must increase that number when I use that as an example. But then, then you can say, actually, I get a 10% discount on that, and it will work that out and go back, because we don't talk in that kind of that linear fashion, like you say, and it just deals with the conversation because it's been built from how people spoke to the form, so it gets that that's how they use it.
So there's been a lot of talk of AI, even like language AI as well. Where do you think we are in terms of implementation of that, from what you've kind of seen, and where do you think it can go to? So you're talking there a little bit about conversational AI is almost like at a slightly different level than in terms of like speech analytics as an example. Where do you think we are in terms of development as the industry today, and where do you think it can go to?
This is a regular conversation I have at the minute, because there's AI is an overused term with a massive amount of, it can mean so many different things, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. I hear AI when people are talking about chatbots. And I think chatbots have a purpose, absolutely, and they can be great in the right situation. But because they're almost programmed for a certain set of events. So if you want to say, what's my balance? Great, chatbot away. That works really, really well. If you want to have a conversation as if you were talking to an agent, that has to be the new breed of conversational AI, where it is literally built up from thousands and thousands of utterances of people who have previously done that process. So it's built upon real live data, as you like, rather than the linear process of they'll say this, then we'll tell them that, then they'll say that, then that will happen, because it doesn't work, and the system then can't be flexible. So the system's got to understand meaning of language, as opposed to what the action is. It's got to actually understand what you're saying, and that, I think, is where AI will go now. It's very early days in that, and we see it quite a lot in terms of when we talk to people about our solution, they think it's AI that they know, which is the chatbot stuff. And then when they see it happen and it be very different in terms of how it behaves, almost, like speaking to an agent, like a human being, they're kind of blown away. And at the minute, we're live with the text version, so you can type into the form and sort of chat with it. And we know that works really well because, again, the research told us customers in debt generally are hiding it, so they don't necessarily want to say it out loud. We've got a prototype for the voice version where you can just talk to it and have that conversation live. And I think that's where it will go ultimately. And it's not like I want to replace all call centers, because I think there'll always be a job for human beings around the more complex, the vulnerability, and where humans can add value in terms of that great thinking. But some of the basic stuff, that voice AI, that where you can do the start of a call, do the basic stuff, get the I&E done, and then move into, okay, well, these customers, this can happen to them. That's absolutely fine. That's really straightforward. But for these, we're going to go and need to get some real specific help. And that might be an agent dealing with a vulnerable case. That's where I think it will help. Humans will add more value dealing with the complexity, and the AI will start to take out the more straightforward bit.
Even in terms of like conversational AI, I suppose, and speech analytics, I suppose there's that contextual piece as well, which is another layer on top. So you're saying that for context, just looking at affordability has got its own specialist language in itself, right? And you might have vulnerability, might have a different specialist language in itself. You have this general speech analytics or AI that doesn't necessarily deal with those specialisms, and you've sort of got to go into it in more detail, which is what you guys have kind of looked at.
Yeah, and I think it's, I still only know a tenth of what the clever academics that deliver our AI piece for us do, but it's things like background noise and things like that you think are nothing to do with kind of actually understanding the language, but it's making sure it can pick out, and also knowing sort of intonation in your voice. So I might stop halfway through a sentence, but I might not be finished talking because actually I'm thinking. Whereas standard tech will kind of say, right, when there's a 2-second gap, assume the customer's finished, cut it, process it, and move on. And actually, what the new breed of AI is doing is listening to the tone and what's happening, where they are. So it's analysing it as it happens and kind of going, but that sentence not finished. I haven't got the final piece of information. Let's just wait. So it's not pre-programmed around a set time. It's actually listening to what's happening, and that's where I just think it's fascinating in terms of what's been developed.
But it's fascinating because you think, well, what we've got is really good and we've come a long way, but actually when you actually talk about it, there's an awful lot further we can actually go in some ways.
Yeah, and I remember, when Alexa first came out, or I suppose I should say any other module that's available, that's in my house. In fact, I shouldn't say it too loud because it will start typing in. But it's when that first came out, we all had the frustrations with it, and you end up shouting at it to try and be really, really clear. Where it's going now is, and it makes me laugh, with ours, we've got our sales guys from Scotland, so we use his accent. I had somebody the other day doing a Birmingham accent, fake Birmingham accent, trying to test that and just seeing how does it cope with accents, how does it cope with, the nuances in how we speak. The slang that we all use is very sort of regional.
Yeah.
But it will work on that, providing the underlying data is those sorts of people have already spoken to the form. So it's learned from that information. And as we go forward, the more usage of the form we get, the better that gets in time.
It also makes you think, just like human beings, which we do this all the time, right? As human beings, they're really quite wonderful machines in terms of being able to do it, right? And we're trying to replicate it, but we're coming a long way. It's fascinating.
Yeah. And we'll never do all of it, and that's where I think, like I say earlier, the humans will add value in the really complex stuff, but we can start to do some of the earlier bits, I think.
The other thing that's happened over the last little while is we've had the pandemic, we've got a lot more people who are working remotely, and it's sort of changing the business dynamics a little bit. And it'd be good to get your perspective on what you've seen in terms of when you've been out in the industry, in terms of, some of us are going back into work, I'm certainly visiting clients or visiting people in the industry again. But I mean, are you seeing that sort of like starting to switch back to the way it was, or do you think we're going to sort of like subtly change permanently?
Yeah, I kind of hope we've changed permanently for the better. And it's really interesting. You've seen all sorts of, so I've got my Inicio hat where
Mm,
we are completely remote. So we started under the pandemic and
mm,
I have two of the team are up in Glasgow and the furthest south is down in Reading. And
mm,
we've all met sort of individually, but we've never all met together. In fact, it's quite
mm,
exciting. This month we're going to have our board meeting all together and actually physically be able to see each other in live. But that's enabled us to recruit, people in Glasgow that we wouldn't have
mm,
had access to. And we've got some great people. And I've seen that in my other hat, which is as a building society NED. I've seen the building society again be able to recruit some really good people
mm.
that are doing less days in the office. And I think it's a spectrum again, isn't it? You've got some organizations trying to get people back in full time because they want to be able to see them, and then you've got others going, no, we'll just go completely remote, it's fine. I think there's that middle ground where a lot of people are settling on 2-3 days a week in the office because you do get something different out of being together and having the water cooler chats or coffee machine chats or
Yeah.
whatever. um, but actually people have seen a much better quality of life, and having less time traveling makes people more efficient, better mental health, all of those things, the values that it brings. So I think it's I hope we can retain that balance.
Do you think it's changing the balance in terms of what we have for meetings in person versus on video, as an example? So it's almost like, do you do the initial discussions or initial get to know people over video, but then when you actually want to cement the relationship, that's when you have the face-to-face meeting. But it becomes almost like a premium meeting versus a regular meeting. You see what I mean? Do you think we can sort of get into that kind of split? What do you kind of think?
It's almost like a quality or a filter piece, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where and it's I think it's changed a lot of things. So we're also doing a funding round, and typically venture capital funding was quite local because it was all
Mm,
done face to face, and the pandemic drove a complete change. And we've seen there's an awful lot of US investment coming into the UK now because they're
mm,
able to do the remote. So it's opened up a lot of markets to people that weren't there. And again, I see it really mixed, and I think there's a personality thing for people around. Some people really want to do face to face. That's the only way it works. I think I'm quite an extrovert, and I still get similar energy from. I don't have a problem with team or Zooms. I kind of still feel like I'm fully present and getting to know people. But then I have been out a little bit more, so it was really nice that, as I say, the Building Societies conference last week, it was lovely to actually see people, and people
yeah.
that I've been speaking to for 2 years but only ever seen head and shoulders of. It's like, oh my god, you've got legs, how exciting. It is.
That's the biggest shock, isn't it? Is that when you meet someone, it's like, you're a lot taller, or you're not quite as tall as I actually thought you were, and it's like I really know you, but and I know your face, but like somehow it's slightly different, right? And then as soon as you talk with them, then you get on with them like a house on fire, like you did before. It's like it's this like weird sort of like 2 seconds.
Yeah. I'm sure we're not judging people on height or anything, but apparently I'm shorter than people imagine. So if I meet anybody in person, just expect me to be short.
Yeah,
But
I'm a lot slimmer.
I don't need the camera. The camera lies.
Yeah. Anyway, so pass quickly on that. The other thing that's come up is around talent, and certainly a lot of people seem to. There's just seems like there's a real sort of crush of like trying to get people to get talent in the market and get new people in. And I suppose my question really is, we didn't have this problem sort of 2-3 years ago. And where do you think all of the people have gone? Right. So it's not like we've suddenly lost massive swathes of the industry. I mean, it's like, but it feels like everyone is busy trying to hire people and find people, and they're struggling. And I suppose it'd be just good to, given what we said about remote working, I mean, what's your perspective on that?
I think it's probably a number of factors. I think one of them is a shift in the skills that
Mm,
are needed. So, not specifically in debt, but I suppose in my banking building society world, there's a
mm,
real shortage of kind of risk and compliance people because that's
mm,
been a massive focus. So the amount that needs to be done there has increased massively. and it's just not kept up to speed. I suppose it's the same as the lorry driver crisis. The industry's moved on, and I think in the debt space, I suppose, if I'm honest, there is an element of, is there a bit of busy fools going on? So organizations are having to deal with growing volumes out of the pandemic, perhaps haven't done the tech stack work they needed to do. So the pressure's on, and then you end up caught in this loop of, I haven't got time to step out, work out what I need to do, and get the right digital solutions in place to give me the headspace to then, be more efficient. So they get caught in this cycle of, I know I need to solve that, but at the minute I'm so busy doing, I'm just going to keep doing. And that is, I've been there as well in banking life, where you kind of like, I don't know how to stop the treadmill.
Yeah.
But you've got to find a way to be able to sort of step back so that you can be more efficient. So I just think it's a combination of, different skill sets, increasing volumes anyway, people working differently, more people going part-time, potentially wanting that quality of life. So I just think there's loads of things happening at the same time. And then also, because of all the digitalization and the tech solutions, that's again a new skill set that people don't necessarily have. So I don't know if the people were there actually in some of those fields, that we need to develop those skills in the industry.
I suppose it's just like a perfect storm, isn't it? And I suppose, and then people can also, they can find jobs in different geographies, which means that maybe a job that might have been available locally is now no longer, the person's still there, but they're no longer working there. So it creates like a local kind of issue. Is that a matter of sort of keeping up? So is it right, remote working as an example, or hiring people remotely is a solution to that in terms of accessing the wider market? It's almost like you have to change to keep up with the talent. I mean, do you think, what's your view on that?
Yeah, and also not just keep up with the talent, but be able to attract and attain. So you're going to be, in a market where there is low unemployment, and people have got that option. The power is with the employees. If you're not providing, people are getting more choosy and kind of saying, I've seen it recently in some recruitment that I saw, where the offers, the things that people were negotiating on were the working from home and the flexibility and that kind of stuff. Whereas previously it might have been, salary or bonus or whatever. The focus has shifted a little bit, and I think organizations need to be able to compete and also offer that values match, that cultural match for people. I'm at work a long time, I want to feel good about it, I want to work with like-minded people and feel like I'm doing good in the world. And it's kind of those things that are shifting, I think, when people are able to be more picky about the job that they do, because they're in the driving seat, really, because they could go and work somewhere else, and that's not always been the case historically.
Do you think people are sort of like reevaluating a little bit the balance of things? I've certainly seen that with a couple of people I know recently, in terms of like sort of changing, maybe from thinking about that balance in terms of remote working gives me a little bit more time to to drop kids off, as an example, or spend more time at home, and we've had an opportunity to do that over the last 2 years, and sort of maybe we're just reevaluating whether we want to give some of those things up.
Yeah, I just seen a really interesting case where an individual has taken a job that's at an organisation that's a third the size of where they were. And that's because during the pandemic, they got young children, and they'd always worked away from home, so they'd just never known any different. Forced to work at home in the pandemic, actually realised they do like their children, and the impact that they can make on them. And has kind of reevaluated career and said, I always thought career was about, I've got to step up, I've got to go bigger role, bigger organisation. But actually now I realise what's important to me is my family. And I don't see that as downsizing or a step back to go to an organisation that's smaller, because I match the culture, I like the flexibility they're going to give me, and I win so much in my personal life that the overall package is much better for me. Whereas historically, I think we just judged it on career progress and whether that was moving in the right direction. People are choosing on a broader set of criteria now, I think.
Be interesting to see how it sort of like plays out over the next even like 20, 30 years in terms of the impact on society, education, the workforce in 30 years' time, in terms of like people having different lives as kids to a certain extent, in terms of access to parents or access to education, or even being locked in for a couple of years, essentially being impacted there. So it'll be fascinating, both in a good way, but also a concerning way, I suppose, in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, those children that went through that period, yeah, what will be, like you say, the longer term impact on them from many perspectives, and the
Yeah,
decisions they make, having gone from, not having a parent around, and then hang on, they're here, and we're
all
at
the
home
time.
again.
Yeah. What I do know is about the kids today is like they're much more digital native than certainly I am, and so that's something we've all had to come up to speed really, really quickly over the last 2 years. So we've been on education, even if they already knew it. So I think to some extent. How do you sort of see the future kind of evolving? Certainly from a machine learning, AI sort of affordability kind of space. I mean, what do you think the next step is? I mean, something like where do you think the market's sort of taking it, and where do you think you want to take it from an implementation point of view?
Yeah, so for us specifically, we've got the core product live, which, as I
Mm,
say, is kind of text-based conversation. Next, our prototype is speaking to it, so the
mhm,
voice side of it, and then it's sort of the flexibility of extending that out. So we're having lots of interesting conversations around the affordability assessment in the origination space, so the
mm,
onboarding piece, because it's the same problem. We've got to assess that affordability element to complete. So that's one space. And then for us, it's into different languages, so sort of Welsh, European languages, different forms. Again, because ours works on the very deep knowledge of a specific form, whatever the American version of the SFS is,
mm,
it's that we would have to understand. So that's our specific roadmap. I think in terms of much broader the tech side of it, I think it is all around that natural language processing, which again is another buzz term that's
mm,
used. But actually, for me, that means I can talk to a computer, but get the experience of talking to a human being on a
mm.
certain set of tasks for a certain purpose. It's never going to do everything, I don't think. But it's just going to get better and better in terms of being more real. And like I say, when we first got Alexa or speech recognition, we were blown away by that. That was exciting. But very quickly we got, well, it's frustrating, it doesn't do this bit goes wrong, and our demands move up that curve, and I think the tech will
Mm.
continue to move with it and just get better at doing those natural conversations.
It's also interesting, also in terms of like the marketing cycle, the development cycle of it, which is you heard a lot about it, sort of like 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Then you've got sort of like very early on implementations of things like Alexa, which you were using to play music, maybe even look at our diary, book things in our diary, those kind of things. But you're sort of like going up that complexity kind of curve, and at a point you get to almost like this is going to do something that's really adding huge amounts of value, and it feels like that we've gone through those early stages and we're actually getting to almost like the implementation stages where you can actually like it's becoming real to a certain extent.
Yeah, and it's that you said earlier, from the generalist to the specialist piece. The
Mm,
generalist do a top level and it's sort of okay. When you get into specialist and you really focus on it, it can do so much more. But it
mm,
takes a lot of time to build each bit of that, and it's got to
yeah,
have the needs got to be there. There's got to be a problem to solve, and we know that for the INE there is a problem to solve because people want
mm,
to do it digitally but struggle. So
yeah.
therefore, it works. It works in that environment. So it's finding the other elements of that we'll see come to the fore.
Well, Rachel, thank you very much. It's fascinating. I really appreciate you making the time. So thank you very much.
Great. Thanks. Great to talk, Chris.